Did you know that 82% of modern professionals are suffering from an emotional crisis that was predicted almost a century ago by a man who never saw a smartphone? A crisis that costs £21.6 billion annually to the global economy, and that you might be experiencing right at this very moment. Napoleon Hill, in 1937, wrote about emotional control in a way that seemed like science fiction. He described brain circuits, thought waves, and the brain's ability to transmit emotions 88 years before neuroscience discovered these connections. How is this possible? Today, we live in an era where 91% of people report high levels of stress, where burnout costs £21.6 billion annually to the global economy, and where 44% of young workers feel completely isolated in the digital work environment. Hill predicted exactly this when he spoke about the need to master emotions to avoid what he called temporary defeats. But here's the question you need to answer. Are you going to continue being a victim of these uncontrolled emotions? Or will you finally learn the three-step system that can transform your relationship with stress and burnout? In the next 25 minutes, I'm going to show you the exact three-step system that Napoleon Hill developed and that modern neuroscience has proven to work. A system that can transform your relationship with stress in less than 30 days. After studying over 500 successful people for 20 years, Hill discovered specific patterns that neuroscience from Stanford and Harvard University has now completely validated. First, let's understand the science behind Hill's discoveries and why they're more relevant today than ever before. Hill talked about something he called faith over fear, the brain's ability to transmit positive thoughts through what he described as brain waves. At the time, this sounded like mysticism. Intro, end, intro, end. Today, we know he was describing precisely what modern neuroscience calls neuroplasticity and neural connectivity. Electroencephalography studies show that our brains actually transmit specific frequencies depending on our emotional state. When we're in fear or stress mode, the orbitofrontal cortex, the area responsible for decision-making, literally shuts down. Hill intuited this when he wrote that negative thoughts destroy the ability to think clearly. Hill intuited this when he wrote that negative thoughts destroy the ability to think clearly. The Praxis program, developed by neuroscientists at Stanford University, validated another one of Hill's concepts, the power of autosuggestion. They discovered that when we repeat specific affirmations about our desired emotional state, we create new neural pathways that literally reprogram our response to stress. Here's the critical connection. In 2025, we're living through exactly the crisis that Hill anticipated. The World Health Organization has officially recognized burnout as a medical condition. It's no longer just fatigue. It's a global epidemic that's destroying careers, relationships, and the mental health of millions of people. But there's a fundamental difference between those who succumb to this crisis and those who thrive despite it. And this difference has nothing to do with luck, circumstances, or financial resources. The difference lies in emotional mastery, exactly what Hill taught nearly a century ago. Understanding these principles is just the first step. The real challenge is applying them in the real world of 2025, where you're dealing with unique pressures that Hill never imagined, impossible deadlines, a constant stream of notifications fragmenting your attention, and digital pressures that never cease. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Our digital era has created a type of emotional overload that has never existed before in human history. We're processing more information in a single day than our ancestors processed in months. Our brains haven't evolved to handle this constant intensity. The result? We live in a permanent state of fight or flight. Our sympathetic nervous system is constantly activated, pumping cortisol and adrenaline as if we were fleeing from a predator. But the predator now is unanswered emails, back-to-back meetings, and the constant pressure to always be on. Hill recognized that the future would bring unique emotional challenges. He wrote about the need to form a mastermind, a mental support group, because he sensed that isolation would be one of the greatest enemies of modern success. Look around you. How many people do you know who feel genuinely connected and supported in their work environments? In the technology sector, where we theoretically have all the tools to connect people, we see the highest rates of burnout and depression. Remote workers report feeling more isolated than ever. The gig economy, which promised freedom, has created unprecedented financial and emotional insecurity. The numbers are alarming. 73% of workers between 25 and 35 years old report symptoms of physical and mental exhaustion. 68% of executives admit that their emotions negatively affect their strategic decisions. And here's the most concerning part. 89% of people believe they have no control over their emotional reactions. But there's a systematic way to regain that control, and it's not through superficial meditation, mindfulness apps, or isolated breathing techniques, although these can help. It's through a structured system that addresses the root of the emotional problem. Hill developed this system based on observing over 500 successful people for 20 years. He identified specific patterns in how these people dealt with destructive emotions and transformed them into a replicable method. Now, here are the 3 steps that will transform your emotional control based directly on Hill's methodology, but adapted for the challenges of 2025. First step, recognize your emotional state before it controls you. Hill called this daily emotional inventory. He observed that successful people developed an almost superhuman ability to identify subtle changes in their emotional state before these changes transformed into destructive reactions. In practice, this means developing what neuroscientists call metacognition, awareness of your own mental processes. You need to become an observer of your own emotions, not a victim of them. Here's how to do this practically. Every 2 hours, take a 30-second pause and ask yourself, what am I feeling right now? Where am I feeling this in my body? What was the trigger for this emotion? It may seem simple, but science shows that the mere act of naming an emotion activates the prefrontal cortex and reduces activity in the amygdala, the brain area responsible for the fight-or-flight response. Hill intuited this when he wrote that what you cannot control begins with what you cannot identify. But Edison had a secret that his biographers never revealed, and that can change your life in 30 seconds. Thomas Edison, one of Hill's favorite case studies, carried a small notebook where he recorded his emotional state 3 times a day. When he felt frustrated with an experiment that wasn't working, he would first write about the frustration before making any decision about how to proceed. Ford did something similar in his factories. He trained his managers to identify the first signs of irritation or impatience before it affected work quality or relationships with employees. You don't need to carry a notebook, but you can use a simple note on your phone. The important thing is to create the habit of observing before reacting. Once you master the art of observing your emotions, the crucial moment arrives, transforming that awareness into the power of choice. This is the second step. Choose your response instead of simply reacting. Hill discovered that there's a window of opportunity between emotional stimulus and our response. He called this the space of controlled thinking. Successful people learn to expand this space and use it strategically. Modern neuroscience confirms this through the concept of cognitive reappraisal. When you recognize a negative emotion, you have approximately 90 seconds before the chemical cascade becomes overwhelming. During those 90 seconds, you can literally rewrite the emotional narrative. Let's use a practical example. Your boss sends you a critical message about a project. Your first reaction might be anger, anxiety, or frustration. In Hill's system, you don't suppress that emotion, you acknowledge it and then ask, how would a successful person respond to this? Henry Ford faced devastating criticism when he launched the Model T. Competitors said his car was too simple, too cheap, that it wouldn't last. Instead of reacting defensively, Ford used this criticism as strategic information. He would ask, what does this criticism teach me about the market? And how can I use this to improve? Carnegie faced brutal personal attacks in the press during his labor negotiations. Instead of responding emotionally, he developed a system. First, he would write a furious response in private. Then he would set that response aside for 24 hours. Finally, he would write a second version, focused on the result he wanted to achieve, not the emotion he was feeling. Here's the practical technique. When you feel an intense emotion, count to 10 and ask yourself, if I were my ideal mentor, how would I respond to this? This simple question activates the most evolved part of your brain and gives you access to cognitive resources that get blocked during emotional reactions. You can practice this by starting with smaller situations, traffic, lines, minor frustrations. The more you train in low-risk situations, the more natural it will become in high-pressure moments. The third and most powerful step is where true mastery happens, channeling that emotion toward your definite purpose. Hill discovered that extraordinary people don't just control negative emotions, they transform them into fuel for their goals. He called this emotional transmutation. Churchill is a perfect example of this. During World War II, he transformed his natural anger against injustice into relentless determination to protect British freedom. His famous phrase, "Never, never, never give up," didn't come from a place of Zen calm. It came from controlled and directed anger. Edison channeled his frustration with failed experiments into productive obsession. Each failure became valuable data that brought him closer to the solution. He literally reprogrammed his brain to see failures as disguised progress. In practice, this means that when you feel anger, instead of suppressing it or exploding, you ask, how can I use this energy to get closer to my goals? When you feel anxiety about a project, you ask, how can this worry help me prepare better? Here's an exercise that Hill used. Identify your definite major purpose, that goal that's most important to you in the next 12 months. Write it in a clear sentence. Now, whenever you feel an intense emotion, ask, how can I use this energy to get closer to this goal? Disney used this technique when facing rejections from investors. Each no became motivation to refine his presentation, improve his concept, or find more visionary investors. He literally transformed dozens of rejections into the fuel that created the Disney empire. Rockefeller did something similar with media criticism about his business practices. Instead of defending himself emotionally, he used each criticism as a map to identify areas where he could legitimately improve his reputation and operations. The key is not to become a person without emotions. It's to become the architect of your emotions instead of being their victim. Now you know the 3 fundamental steps, but there's a crucial difference between knowing and mastering. Hill identified that 92% of people fail not from lack of knowledge, but from lack of consistent application. How do you ensure these steps become part of your nature? Hill developed what he called the 7 Positive Emotions Protocol. He identified that successful people deliberately cultivated 7 specific emotional states: enthusiasm, faith, hope, love, romance, pleasure, and the desire for achievement. They didn't wait for these emotions to appear naturally. They created them through structured practices. Let's translate this to 2025. Instead of starting your day checking emails or social media, both designed to trigger stress and social comparison, you can begin with what Hill called morning emotional setup. This involves 5 minutes dedicated to intentionally cultivating one of the 7 positive emotions. It could be listening to music that sparks enthusiasm, reviewing your goals to activate the desire for achievement, or simply visualizing an important accomplishment to awaken hope. Hill observed that people like Carnegie and Ford had specific morning rituals that put them in the right emotional state before facing the day's challenges. Carnegie would read inspiring passages from Stoic philosophers. Ford would spend 15 minutes visualizing improvements in his factories. The important thing isn't to copy exactly what they did, but to understand the principle. You can deliberately choose your emotional state instead of letting circumstances choose it for you. But here's what productivity gurus won't tell you. Hill predicted that our obsession with hacks would be exactly what would prevent us from achieving real success. Even in 1937, he realized that people were starting to seek instant results instead of developing sustainable systems. Today, this tendency has reached extreme proportions. We want to hack our sleep, our productivity, our happiness. We download apps hoping that 15 minutes of meditation will solve decades of dysfunctional emotional patterns. Hill argued that true emotional mastery comes through what he called persistent application of correct principles. It's not sexy, it's not viral, but it's what actually works. The people he studied, Edison, Ford, Carnegie, Roosevelt, didn't have secret techniques. They had systems they applied consistently, day after day, year after year. They understood that emotional control is like building muscle. It requires regular training, gradual progression, and patience with the process. The good news is you don't need 20 years to see results. Modern studies on neuroplasticity show that new neural patterns can form within weeks with consistent practice. But the key word is consistent. Carnegie discovered that 87% of people fail not due to lack of knowledge, but because of this fatal mistake you're probably making right now. Hill recommended forming what he called a mastermind, a group of people committed to mutual growth. In 2025, this could be a virtual accountability group, a mentor, or even a coach. Carnegie had a group of 5 close advisors who met weekly. They didn't just discuss business strategies, but also challenged each other to maintain high standards of emotional control. If Carnegie was reacting emotionally to a situation, his advisors had permission to hold him accountable. Ford did something similar with Henry Bennett, his right-hand man for over 30 years. Bennett had specific authorization to interrupt Ford when he was making decisions based on emotion instead of strategic logic. Today, you can create a similar system using simple technology. It could be a WhatsApp group with 3 people committed to personal growth, where you share your weekly emotional goals and support each other mutually. Or it could be a weekly check-in ritual with a mentor or coach, where you review situations where you applied or failed to apply the 3 steps of Hill's system. The important thing is to create external accountability, because our mind is an expert at rationalizing emotionally destructive behaviors when we're alone. Hill also developed what he called stress inoculation, the deliberate practice of exposing yourself to small emotional challenges to build resilience for bigger challenges. Edison deliberately did this by putting himself in uncomfortable social situations to practice maintaining composure. Ford tested his patience by taking on projects with tight deadlines. Carnegie sought out difficult conversations with unions to train his ability to negotiate under emotional pressure. You can do something similar by starting with micro-challenges, having a difficult conversation you've been putting off, setting a boundary with someone who usually drains your energy, or taking on a project that's slightly outside your comfort zone. The idea isn't to traumatize yourself, but to gradually expand your capacity to maintain emotional clarity in challenging situations. There's a 23-second difference between people who transform their lives and those who continue in the same destructive routines. Want to know what it is? After establishing the basic practices, we reach the advanced level, how to continuously evolve your emotional control, even when the system fails. Hill observed that even extraordinary people went through periods where their emotional systems failed. The difference wasn't in perfection, but in the speed of recovery and the ability to learn from setbacks. Carnegie had periods where he reacted emotionally to press criticism. Ford had outbursts of anger that damaged important relationships. Edison went through phases of deep discouragement after financial failures. What set them apart was that they treated these failures as valuable data, not as evidence of personal inadequacy. They asked, "What can I learn about my emotional triggers? How can I strengthen my system to avoid this in the future?" This mindset of constant growth is perhaps the most valuable insight from Hill's system. Emotional perfection is not the goal. Continuous emotional evolution is the goal. Here's a practical framework to implement this. Every Friday, dedicate 15 minutes to reviewing your week through 3 questions. First, in which situations did I successfully apply the 3 steps of emotional control? Second, where did I react emotionally instead of responding strategically? Third, what adjustments can I make to my system next week? This weekly review was something Carnegie did religiously. He called it an emotional audit and credited this practice as fundamental to his continuous development as a leader. Carnegie discovered his emotional vulnerability hours after losing £2 million in one day due to a decision made in the wrong emotional state. Do you know what yours are? Practical implementation also requires you to identify your times of day or week when you're most prone to destructive emotional reactions. For some people, it's the early morning hours before coffee. For others, it's late afternoon when energy is low. Some are more vulnerable on Mondays, others on Fridays. Edison identified that he was more impatient and prone to emotional decisions after 6 p.m. So he implemented a rule: no important decisions after 6 p.m. If something urgent came up, he would write down his concerns and revisit them the next morning with a fresh mind. Ford discovered that he was more emotionally reactive during long meetings. So he limited all meetings to a maximum of 45 minutes and always took a 5-minute break in the middle to emotionally recalibrate. You can identify your own patterns by doing simple tracking for 2 weeks. Note when you feel most prone to emotional reactions and what contexts seem to be consistent triggers. Then you can create protection protocols for these vulnerable moments, whether by avoiding important decisions, creating strategic pauses, or simply being more aware of your emotional tendencies during these periods. Now you possess exactly what was promised: the complete 3-step system that Napoleon Hill developed almost a century ago. Recognize your emotions before they control you, choose your strategic response instead of reacting impulsively, and channel that emotional energy toward your goals. You didn't just learn theory, you now have a practical method validated by modern neuroscience that transformed thousands of historical leaders and can transform your life too. You didn't just learn theory, you now have a practical method validated by modern neuroscience that has transformed thousands of historical leaders and can transform your life too. You understand why this system is more relevant today than ever, living in an era where 82% of people are suffering from burnout and where emotional control has become a crucial competitive advantage. The question now isn't whether this system works. It has been tested by thousands of successful people over nearly 90 years. The question is whether you will implement it in your life. This is your crossroads. Continue being a slave to your emotions, reacting like 82% of people who live in emotional chaos, or become the master of your emotions and have the competitive advantage that only 18% of people possess. Your emotional transformation begins now with a simple action. Before going to sleep tonight, set 3 alarms on your phone: 9 a.m., 2 p.m., and 6 p.m. When they ring, stop for 30 seconds and ask these 3 questions. What am I feeling? Where do I feel it in my body? What was the trigger? This is your first day of emotional freedom. In the second week, add the second step. When you identify an intense emotion, count to 10 and ask, how would my ideal mentor respond to this? Again, don't seek perfection, seek practice. In the third week, integrate the third step. Channel that emotional energy toward your main goal. In 7 days, you'll already notice the difference. In 21 days, you'll have created a new neural pattern. Napoleon Hill observed hundreds of leaders and discovered they all had one characteristic in common: they mastered their emotions before their emotions mastered them. Edison, Ford, Carnegie, they all applied these 3 steps daily. The difference between you and them isn't talent or opportunity, it's the decision to start today. Don't let another day pass being a victim. Set your alarms now before closing this video and join the 18% who control their emotional destiny. Your future self is waiting for this decision.